Good morning, everybody. Welcome to your last Friday Human Anatomy of the semester. We are going to continue today with, we're starting today, the respiratory system. So this is nicely ties in with what you covered in lab this week. In advance of class today, you had a program with just some reading on the respiratory system. Just a reminder to fill out the ideological awareness survey as well. You'll see that same reading on your program for Monday. So there's not going to be any new reading, but I'll just keep the same reading on the respiratory system on there. And that's it. That's all the reading for the semester. We're going to cover the respiratory system today and Monday. And that's going to be it. Now you know everything there is to know about the human body. But before you know all that, we have a few things to get to. And our agenda today is going to look like this. We're going to play a game called Name That Endocrine Organ. It used to be on CBS, but it's not anymore. We're going to cover the respiratory system. Then I have a short video for you kind of tying into the respiratory system. Then we'll continue, see how much we get through today. And we'll wrap things up with a bunch of reminders and schedule details. I've got some details about upcoming assessments and things like that as far as our schedule goes and study guides and all that fun stuff. So before we play Name That Endocrine Organ, questions? All right, let's do it. Get your cellular telephones out. Go ahead and scan that QR code. So this is a Google survey. I'm actually trying something different. I made it a quiz. You're getting, if you do this quiz, you're getting 2 participation points. So don't worry about like your score doesn't count towards your overall score. But I just wanted to set it up this way so you could see the correct responses afterwards. And I just wanted to see how it worked. So it's just a test run, but remember, it's just participation points for completing it, just like a survey. Everyone got it? Nope.
Oh.
We good? Grace, you're good. Okay. Asher in the back, you good? Got it? Okay, cool. All right, let's do it. There's no speed or anything, but the faster you do it, I don't know, the cooler you are. So 2 questions on this. I don't have a timer set up on this, so I'm just going to give you a few seconds to scroll through the list. And I apologize, actually, I should have said, what are these? Not what is this? It should be plural, not singular, but you all probably figured that out. You're wicked smart. What is their primary role? It's really what I should have said. Got it? Next one. There's 4 questions. Well, there's 4 questions total. 8 questions total, I guess, 4 pairs of questions. Boom, what's this? Oh, wait. Psych. There we go. All right, next question. And last question here. And then you can submit your form. And I think you should get your score right away when you submit your form. Let me know if that's the case. You do? All right. It worked. So a little bit of a self-assessment for you. Make sure you know these organs. Make sure you know what their primary role is. Again, it's an anatomy class, but I do want you to know the very general role that they play in the body. Go ahead, Dan.
Mind going back to 1, 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can just go through it real quick if you want. So what's 1? What is this? Just go ahead and yell. Adrenal, what's the primary role? More or less stress. I want to just emphasize real quick that especially the glucocorticoids excreted by the adrenal cortex, they play a really important role in maintaining your energy balance generally, not just in stressful situations. So I'm saying stress is like the main thing, especially the adrenal medulla, where adrenaline is produced, norepinephrine, epinephrine, those catecholamines. But I just want you to know the adrenal glands do more than just stress, but we're just going to call it stress to get its one kind of primary role named. 2, what is this guy? Thyroid, what does it do? Generally regulates your body's metabolism, metabolic rate. What's this guy? Now there's 2 parts of the pituitary. What are they called? Anterior and posterior pituitary. Which one of those is a true endocrine gland? Anterior, good. And what's its primary role? Yeah, it regulates a whole bunch of other stuff. So it does produce like growth hormone directly, but it regulates your thyroid and producing thyroid regulating hormones. It regulates your adrenal glands and producing those energy balance, stress hormones. Plays lots of different roles in regulating all of these different things and kind of coordinating their function. Finally, what's this guy? Pancreas looks like an upside down Nike swoosh. And what is its primary role? Glucose, energy. You can remember that. You can see it looks like a Nike swoosh and you need energy to do stuff. So it's regulating glucose. There you go. Mnemonic device for you. Any questions on those? Cool. Well, let's talk about the respiratory system then. Respiration involves 4 primary processes. The first is pulmonary ventilation. So this is what we commonly think of as breathing, is simply moving air in and out of our lungs. The second process is external respiration. Now, don't be fooled. It's external because it's the movement of gases, and we're just going to focus on O2 and CO2 here, between the air in the lungs and your blood. So keep in mind, I'm saying external respiration, but it happens inside your lungs, although technically those air sacs are external to your body, right? And so it does happen kind of what we think of commonly within our body, but this is external respiration, the exchange of gases between your blood and the outside world. We then need to transport those gases via the circulatory system. So this is primarily, exclusively your blood, which is, of course, powered. Its movement is powered by your heart. And then we have the last step in respiration, which is internal respiration. This is when the O2 and CO2 are exchanged between your blood and body tissues throughout your body. So it's really important to think of this as this 4-step process. Now, we're not really going to talk about, internal respiration here. That's kind of more physiology. Transport of respiratory gases is your circulatory system, which we didn't cover in depth this semester outside of the heart. External respiration we'll talk about very briefly, primarily in terms of the anatomical structure of the place where this happens. We will spend most of our time talking about pulmonary ventilation and the structures that allow you to move air in and out of your lungs. Sound like a good start? Cool. Let's talk about, let's see. Yep. So generally speaking, we can then divide the respiratory system into 2 major zones, anatomical structural zones, right? The first is what's called the conducting zone. This is basically just passageways through which air moves and gas exchange does not happen. However, these structures play a really important role in 3 things happens to air that comes into your body. It's filtered or cleaned, it's humidified, and it's warmed. Because when that air gets to your lungs, you want it to be clean of particles or potential pathogens. You need it to be humid because the gas exchange depends on that fluid environment, that water environment. And you want it to be warm because you don't want those structures to experience cold temperatures because they won't work as well as you lose compliance in your lungs and things like that. So the conducting zone are these passageways through which air moves, but they serve important functional roles in filtering, humidifying, and warming that air before it comes in. Once that air travels through that conducting zone, it then gets to what's called the respiratory zone, which is where the gas exchange actually happens in the lungs. AKA external respiration. So gas exchange between the air and the outside environment, that's in your lungs. and your blood. And this includes these structures that are called alveoli. I'll talk about that. Probably we won't get to that till Monday, but this is where that gas exchange happens. So the shorthand way to think about this is respiratory zone is where gas exchange happens. Conducting zone is where gas exchange doesn't happen. I'm going to start off talking about the conducting zone in detail. We're going to walk through the path of air through the conducting zone, and then we'll get to the respiratory zone, maybe today, maybe Monday, we'll see. So the conducting zone, yep, good.
This is a bit of a comparative
Mhm.
question, but do these terms as well apply to animals that have different respiratory systems? Sort of?
Other vertebrates definitely, because they have, other vertebrates with lungs definitely, right? Because not all vertebrates have lungs. There's lots of salamanders, for example, that don't have lungs. Other air-breathing invertebrates, they have pretty different structures, so I don't think this terminology is used for them, but ask Dr. Carino, he could tell you. Yep, because like, for example, insects have like a tracheal system, and it's just a totally different system to exchange gases. Yeah, it's a good question. Other questions? All right, let's talk about the conducting zone. So not surprisingly, this starts in the nose, then moves to the nasal cavity, and then two structures called the pharynx and then the larynx, and then your trachea, which you're all familiar with from your cat dissections, and then into the primary bronchi, which you're also familiar with from your cat dissections in lab last week. So that's the general gist of the conducting zone. You should know those structures and know the order through which air passes, which is generally pretty intuitive. I mean, you can think that it starts in the nose and then goes to the nasal cavity. And we're going to talk about each of those in a little detail here. First, let me actually show you all of this in a diagram. So this is what the overall respiratory system looks like. All of these terms in blue, you should know and be able to identify, maybe not right now, but by the end of class today or Monday. This diagram is from your book, so you all have this. Notice here, we're going to start with the nose. We've got the nasal cavity. Then we have the pharynx and the larynx here, have our trachea, and then we have the trachea bifurcates into a left and right primary, the left and right primary bronchi. We'll talk about the alveoli and the lung in more detail when we get to the respiratory zone, but let's just focus on the conducting zone to start. So let's start off with the nose. I'm going to show you this diagram. I'm not going to ask you to know all of these terms on the nose, but I want you to know that these parts of your nose have specific terms to describe them. So for example, ala of the nose, you might remember we talked about the coxal bones. There was an ala of the coxal bone. It means wing. Your nose, this little bit right here, it's called the ala of your nose. The apex is the little thing you boop. You've got your nostrils, of course, which is an anatomical term, but also a term that you're all familiar with. And so, yeah, all of the parts of the nose have these specific terms. What I want you to know about the nose is that it's important because it's the first place where air enters your body. And it's super important in both moistening and warming the air. As the air goes through your nasal cavity, we'll see these structures in a second. Remember, it just doesn't go straight down to your lungs, but there are those structures in your ethmoid bone. You have the the superior and the middle nasal conchae. And then you have separate paired bones called your inferior nasal conchae. And those are kind of that swirly shape, and that moves air around and creates turbulence so that it can be both moistened and warmed as well as filtered. So this whole chamber is lined with these mucous membranes that suck up stuff you don't want in the air. The nose is also important, interestingly, for producing speech. And as humans, speech is super important to us in our evolutionary history. And so that might sound a little bit trivial on one hand, but it is important for producing sounds. This is why when you hold your nose, you sound funny, or if you have a cold and you're stuffed up, your voice sounds different and people can tell. That's because the nose is no longer functioning as that resonating chamber, or it's functioning differently. The nose also has something else that's really important, and that is smelling. Yeah, it houses those olfactory receptors. And we talked a little bit about the olfactory bulbs when we looked at the brain. Those receptors are actually in the nose and super important for smelling. Although we as humans kind of suck at smelling. We're not very good at it. And we can smell for sure, right? Don't get me wrong, but we compared to other, especially other mammals. Our smell is not good compared to, say, a dog or something like that. But dogs can't sweat. So if they get arrogant, they're like, oh, we're better than people because we can smell better. We'd be like, yo, you can't sweat. And then the dog is going to know its place. All right, great. So let's talk a little bit about the nasal cavity then. The air passes through the nose, enters through the nostrils, passes through the nose, and then goes into the nasal cavity. Now remember, the nasal cavity is divided. We have a left and a right. It's divided by that septum that's partially formed by cartilage, partially formed by your vomer. You remember that bone from the skull. And the cavity leads back basically to the nasopharynx. I'm going to show you a diagram in just a second here. And then at the back of this cavity are these openings where the air passes through called choanae. And then there are, I mentioned that all of the inside of the nasal cavity is lined with these mucous membranes, and there's two kinds of them. There's the olfactory mucosa, which is on the roof and houses those smell receptors. And then there's the respiratory mucosa, which lines the nasal cavity, and it's composed of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That's a mouthful. So 4 words, but you should know all of these words. We know what pseudostratified columnar cells are. We know what epithelial cells are, and you know what ciliated cells are. So the cilia are these little hairs that help to collect stuff from the air that you don't want. And in the nasal cavity, those cilia move to push everything back. And they bring it in, which kind of counterintuitively, they work to, the way the cilia work is they're bringing everything back into your nasal cavity, which importantly is continuous with your oral cavity. So basically your nose is constantly filtering out stuff from the air that you end up swallowing, because it's a lot better to have it in the super acidic environment of your stomach where you can digest it and not get hurt by it than for it to end up in your lungs. Neat. See some writing. I'll take a pause, make sure you've got that, see what questions you have. All right, let me just show you a diagram. So this ties into the same concepts here, but I'm going to show you, it's actually not a diagram. This is actually a sagittal section of a cadaver here. And you can see the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha, or conchae, plural. Now remember again that the superior and middle are part of your ethmoid bone. A little review for you for your lab practical. The inferior are two paired bones. They're separate bones from the ethmoid. We have our hard and soft palate. You recognize this from lab as well. And so air is entering through the nostrils. It circulates through all of these kind of convoluted structures in the nasal cavity, and then moves back here into the nasopharynx. You can see that there. And is there another term on there I want you to know? Oh, and then the olfactory epithelium is up here at the very top, and you can see these olfactory nerves. This is where your sense of smell operates. And then the rest of this membrane, the rest of this surface area is covered by this mucosa that is cleaning the air, humidifying the air, and warming the air. Remember all those particles you breathe in, that cilia moves the particles and the mucus back to the back of your throat, and you swallow it. Yes, questions, Dan?
So is there a reason why the nasal conchae are darker? Is it because of the blood or?
Oh, in this, I don't know why they're darker in this cadaver. Yeah, no idea.
Others, they're lighter.
Mm-hmm. I don't know why they're different colors in this. It's just the way the cadaver is preserved. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Functionally, it's not important for what we're talking about anyway. Mm-hmm. Ethan?
So is it like a trail of pathways that like it loops, or is it more of like a filter system where it has to go through different membranes or whatever?
It doesn't travel through any membranes. It just creates turbulence so that the air circulates and so that it comes into contact with those membranes more. Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not traveling through any membranes. It's just that structure creates turbulence. So the air, instead of just going straight, basically forms little cyclones before it goes back down. So that way, more of the air comes into contact with this mucosa. So you can collect more of the junk that you're breathing in. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then the air goes through the nasal cavity. That's all we're going to say, and then moves down to the pharynx. Let me show you a diagram of that. This is just it's kind of a funnel-shaped passageway that connects the nasal cavity to your mouth, right? And you can divide it into 3 sections. The first 2, meaning the 2 through which air passes first and that are most superior, are the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. And it's at the oropharynx we have the juncture with the oral cavity. So the nasopharynx most of the time only contains air. Although if all of you have experienced the wonderful experience when you forcefully vomit and stuff comes up from here and some of it gets up into your nasal cavity through your nasopharynx, super fun there, right? Especially when you get that acidy stuff from your stomach. Awesome. But most of the time it's just air. The oropharynx is this juncture between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx here is important. I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail, but that contains both air and food, but hopefully not too much at the same time. Now, what's important to note here anatomically is that the mucosal lining changes along the length of this structure. I mentioned at the nasal cavity, we have these ciliated pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial cells because they're capturing all of those particles and moving them back here. But as you move down, you might remember from lab that as you move down, and especially once you get to the esophagus, that epithelial layer becomes a stratified squamous cells. And those are cells that are constantly being kind of abraded by the food you intake and then sloughed off, and then the other layers are underneath it. And that's because down here, they're constantly being rubbed by food and anything that you consume, whereas up here, they only have air passing over them most of the time. So takeaway message, you've got this pharynx, connects the nasal cavity to the oral cavity, and below, it's divided into 3 sections, nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The word oro refers to mouth. And you can remember that because the O is like a mouth, you know, like if you go ooh, it's a mouth. I don't know. It's a dumb mnemonic device, but I'm going to help make that connection. We then move down into the larynx, also commonly referred to as the voice box. And so we have our hyoid bone here, and we have the structure surrounded by cartilage. Now, your textbook gets into lots of detail about these cartilaginous structures associated with the larynx. I'm going to kind of gloss over that, but I want to make sure you know that this is rigid cartilage, and it is hyaline cartilage. We talked about that in lab, these rings around the trachea here, right? Those are all hyaline cartilage. I mentioned too the transition in those epithelial cells. Superiorly, we have these pseudostratified columnar cells. Oh no, excuse me. Let me back up for a second. I want to make sure I got clear. I talked about the transition in those epithelial cells. Now, when we get to the larynx is only going to contain air unless you're choking, right? So at this point, that epithelial can transition now back to these pseudostratified columnar cells. But what's important here, as you get lower, that epithelial layer transitions to these ciliated cells, but now they're moving everything up because you don't want to just push goop and particles that you don't want back into your lungs. It actually moves everything back up into the oral cavity again, so that it can basically get dumped down your esophagus. And so this is what happens when you do something like clear your throat. You get a little bit of that mucus up out of your larynx or out of your trachea, and you bring that up and then you swallow it and it goes back down. So that's exactly what's happening here. So the ciliated cells in the nasal cavity are moving everything down. Everything in the ciliated cells here are moving things up. Basically, the idea is to get them out of the respiratory pathway and into the digestive pathway. I'm going to finish talking about the larynx, and then we're going to show a short video here. When we talk about the 3 primary functions of the larynx, it is the voice box, so it's important for voice production, provides an open airway through which air is traveling to the lungs, and it has a special structure that makes sure, that food and air go in separate tubes at the right time. So our bodies are really kind of poorly constructed, and they're constructed in such a way that at the back of your oral cavity, basically, the path for air and the path for food crisscross, right? And air has to go down the trachea, which is anterior, and your food goes down your esophagus, which is posterior. And so those two things have to cross, and you have to do it really, really well. It's not a huge deal if you get some air down your esophagus, but it's a really big deal if you get a chunk of food down your larynx. In fact, it could be quite life-threatening, as you all know. So to prevent that from happening, actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'll talk about that in a second. First, I want to talk about the larynx's role in voice production. There's a couple structures there, and you remember this from your visible body portion of lab. We have these vocal folds or vocal cords. Those are synonymous that you can control very, very precisely to change the way the air coming out of your lungs sounds and resonates. We also have additional folds called the vestibular folds that don't produce any sound. They're just superior to those vocal folds. And then we have something called the rima glottitis. This is the opening between the vocal folds. And then if we put that rima glottitis and the vocal folds together, we have something called the glottis. The glottis is basically the sound producing structure in your larynx. It's that opening plus those folds. Go ahead, Dan.
Is the vestibular folds moved for something like burping?
That's a good question. No idea yeah, that's great. I would maybe guess yes, but I don't know much about the anatomy of burps. I'd be curious though. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the larynx here. Make sure you got this stuff. Now I do want to play this video for you. Oh yeah, perfect. Actually, I have one more slide in the video. So as I mentioned, the larynx is important for voice production, and the length of the vocal folds changes with pitch. And so this is what produces a low or a high voice in terms of pitch, is the length of those vocal folds. Whereas the volume depends on how much air, how quickly you're pushing air across those folds, right? And so that's why generally people are kind of limited to a certain vocal range in terms of pitch. Based on the size of their vocal folds. There's not much you can do to change that. But your volume can change dramatically depending how forcefully you're pushing air through there. Now, what's particularly interesting too is that when you whisper, you're not actually using your vocal cords. You can produce speech sounds without using these. So this is why folks with, say you get throat cancer or something like that, these vocal folds become non-functional. You can still produce speech. It's just only a whisper. So when you're whispering, you're basically doing all the same things that produce speech. You're just not using those vocal folds. You can try it. It's good times. Other important thing you can do is you can actually keep this epiglottis closed. I didn't mention, how did I not put epiglottis in here? Oh, I must have moved the slide outside. I just want to check one thing. Oh, I have to add that back in. I must have accidentally removed the slide. So the epiglottis is the little flap. You remember this from lab that basically closes over the trachea when you swallow to ensure that food and drink doesn't go down the trachea, right? Or down through the larynx into the trachea. What you can consciously do is close that epiglottis and at the same time try to exhale. And when you do like that thing, if you're trying to lift a big weight or something like that. And what that does is it increases the pressure in your thoracic cavity. And so you might do this if you're trying to lift something heavy to stabilize your trunk. Folks often do this when they're straining to defecate too, because it increases the pressure in this cavity, which will then force things out the other end. And then I have a little bit here about the innervation of the larynx, but we didn't get into tons of detail about these nerves, so don't worry about that for right now. That is your larynx. I want to show you a video, and then I want to get into, sorry here. Yeah, we'll talk about the trachea next. That's actually perfect. So before I show the video, what questions do you have? All right, I'm going to show this. I'm going to pause this on the recording because it doesn't really work to record video. Oops, sorry, people at home. Okay, remember that Monday is our last lecture. Tuesday, during lab time, we're going to have quiz number 6, which I'll share details about in a second. And then we're going to have a lab practical review. I don't have anything structured in mind for that, other than a chance where all of us have a free block on our schedule, and I'll be in the room and you can look at specimens and ask questions and review things and that kind of thing. So once you finish your quiz, it's up to you how long you want to stay. But that is some space that's kind of reserved to make sure you're getting what you need to do well on that lab practical. Then your lecture exam number 3 will be available starting Wednesday morning through the end of the day, Monday. That's an open book, open note exam. Details about that are in your class program for Monday, your last class program of the semester. And then Friday is your lab practical. Remember, there's 2 time slots for that, one starting at 1:30 and one starting at 3. That information is in your class program as well. Other pieces of vital information. Lab is open until 7 a.m. Friday. So please don't expect access to the lab on Friday morning to study for your practical. I'll need to be in there getting stuff set up. Otherwise, it's open all week with the exception of Monday afternoon for a couple hours when I teach my other class. So please use the room. The best way to study for the practical is to be in there looking at stuff. Don't be shy about taking out specimens, your cats, your sheep hearts, whatever you want to do. The microscope slides are all set up. All the other models are around the room. With this in mind, Chase is holding not 1, but 2 tutoring sessions next week for you. Her regular Tuesday session, which is a pushback to a slightly different time. Normally it's 6 to 8. It's going to be 6:30 to 8:30 because we have our biology picnic in the afternoon. That link is in the class program. It's going to be online for 2 hours. You can drop in at any time. And then Thursday afternoon, she's going to be in the lab room for 2 hours with specimens and happy to go over things with you. So you've got some review time during lab, then you've got online review time, and then you've got some extra time on Thursday with Chase. So let me know if you have any questions. I have more information for you. I know you guys want to go, and we still have like 2 minutes, but I've got more exciting news for you. There is a study guide for your lab practical now available in Visible Body. So if you go to Visible Body and go all the way down to the bottom, you'll see lab practical number 2 study guide. I broke down lab by lab all of the terms you need to know, what you need to know for a model versus a cat versus a specimen, et cetera, et cetera. I included some diagrams in there to kind of help it all be in one place, but I want to emphasize that it's not comprehensive. So there's diagrams that are in your lab guides that aren't in the study guide that you should make sure you check out. But importantly, I put a list of all the stuff you need to know. It's a long list. The lab practical is going to be tough. Take some time, make sure you're preparing for it. We covered a lot over those 5 labs. Ready for more information? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Lab practical will be the same setup as last.
It will be, yes. Yeah, thanks for asking that. Same setup. I'll do probably 40 questions again, set across 12 to 15 stations. All right, quiz 6, which is during lab time next week. That is going to cover the lymphatic, immune, and endocrine systems only. So the respiratory system is not on quiz 6. It will cover these 3 systems. It is closed book, when you can expect multiple choice or short answer questions. And by short answer, I mean like 1 or 2 word, like fill in the blank. So for example, you can expect to see a diagram with arrows pointing to things and you label them, like that kind of short answer. There's not going to be any longer written responses, closed book. Instead, I'm going to save those for the lecture exams because then you'll have your textbook and your notes and your resources to answer those. So quiz 6 will be in during lab time on Tuesday. I think that's all of the information I have. That's all the announcements anyway. Any other questions about logistics? I have a Venn diagram for you too. Yeah, it's the last one of the semester, guys. I know. So with that in mind, there you go. So let me know if you have questions with anything. I will look forward to seeing everyone on Monday. Have a great week. Enjoy the sunshine. It's supposed to be like super nice. So, oh yeah, it's Earth Day and sunny Earth Day. I like that.